The new thriller from the New York Times bestselling author of The Last Flight is The Lies I Tell by Julie Clark. In The Lies I Tell, we meet Meg Williams, Maggie Littleton, Melody Wild. Different names for the same person. Whoever she is, one thing's for sure. She's a con artist who tells you exactly what you need to hear. And by the time she's done, you've likely lost everything. In the novel, we also meet Kat Roberts, who's been waiting 10 years for the woman who upended her life to return. And now that she has, Kat is determined to be the one who exposes her. But as the two women grow closer, Kat's long-held assumptions begin to crumble, leaving Kat to wonder who Meg's true target really is. The Lies I Tell dives deep into the psyches and motivations of two women and their unwavering quest to seek justice for the past and rewrite the future. The Lies I Tell is being published by Sourcebooks Landmark, and it's a twisted domestic thriller you really don't want to miss. Welcome to The Reader's Couch, a podcast that brings you lively conversations with some of your favourite authors and bookish personalities. Over here, the couch is always booked, but I've moved some books to the side table and fluffed some cushions so I can welcome a guest or two to come lounge with us. Today on the couch, we have Kate Quinn, and she's here to talk to me about her latest novel, The Diamond Eye. A historical fiction novel based on a true story about a quiet bookworm who becomes history's deadliest female sniper. Stay tuned. A novel that centers friendship, loneliness, and hope to add to your reading list is Remarkably Bright Creatures by Shelby Van Pelt. In the novel, we meet Tova Sullivan. After her husband dies, she takes a night job as a janitor at an aquarium. Tova enjoys talking to the sea creatures, and she's particularly fond of Marcellos, a giant octopus, and he becomes fond of her too. We also meet Cameron Cashmore, who joins Tova on the night shift, and the two soon realize that Cameron's mother, who disappeared after leaving him with an aunt, and Tova's son, who died after falling off a boat, might have known each other. And Marcellos, who lived in the sea before his capture, is the only creature who knows for sure. Remarkably Bright Creatures is a fantastical take on a cross-species friendship that is equally charming, witty, and insightful. Remarkably Bright Creatures is being published by Eco Books, and it's a charming, warm-hearted read you really don't want to miss. Hi readers, welcome again to The Reader's Couch. I'm your host, Victoria Wood, and here on the couch with me is a New York Times and USA Today best-selling author of historical fiction. And she's here with me to talk about her latest novel, The Diamond Eye. Please welcome to the couch, Kate Quinn. Hey, Kate.
Hey, Victoria. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. Super excited to have you here. Can't wait to talk about The Diamond Eye. But before we kind of get into the mix of things, I really want to gauge your excitement. On a scale of 1 to 10, how are you feeling? How excited are you?
It has been an absolute roller coaster since this book came out. It always feels like I've been tossed into the tumble dry cycle of the dryer. But very excited indeed. I'd say I'm easily at an 11.
Awesome. Love it. So your novel, The Diamond Eye, I want readers to hear straight from you. Tell us about your novel and what can readers expect going in?
Well, this novel, in essence, tells the story of a fascinating real-life historical woman from Ukraine. She was a single mother, a graduate student, a library researcher whose life was completely upended when Hitler invaded her homeland and who ended up becoming the most effective female sniper, not only of World War II, but of all time. Her story is real. Her name is Lyudmila Pavlichenko. She had the nickname Lady Death. And she would absolutely be on the barricades defending Ukraine if she were alive today, and she is the heroine of The Diamond Eye.
Listen, when I read this book, I was fortunate. I read an early copy months ago. I think it was like the end of the year, early this year. The last thing I was expecting is the real life struggle we're going through watching folks over in Ukraine. I mean, it's just kind of wild, writing about this very brave woman in her time and just, again, how amazing of a sharpshooter she was. And then kind of watching people in real life in Ukraine defending their home country and some people even going back as well. I mean, isn't it just very interesting, the time lapse? I mean, what are your thoughts?
I think that, absolutely she would be one of the defenders we're reading about today. And one of the reasons I know that is because I literally just yesterday read about a Ukrainian woman who is a sniper currently in the Kiev area, I believe, who has the nickname Charcoal, which I just am thinking of long and slow burning and you handle with care. And that's a great nickname. And somewhere out there, Lyudmila Pavlichenko is nodding in approval.
I agree. Charcoal and Lady Death. I think they would be an amazing duo.
Oh, they would.
Absolutely. So, Kate, again, this is based on a real life woman that you wrote about in The Diamond Eye. What inspired you to tell her story? I mean, did you happen upon it? How did you find out about her? Because this is the first time I'm hearing about this woman. So I'd love to know your backstory on discovering this story, but also your inspiration to decide to actually tell her story in this novel.
Well, as so often happens, I ran across the idea for this book, while I was researching another book entirely. And that was when I happened to be doing my research for my 2 times ago novel, The Huntress, which had a large component in it about the Night Witches, which was the all-female regiment of bomber pilots that flew against Hitler's Eastern Front. And when I was reading about them, I was suddenly reading about a great many more World War II Soviet war heroines. And the reason that was is because the Soviet Union was the only allied nation that allowed women officially in combat. In none of the other allied nations would you see women. They might be in espionage, they might be in partisan fighting, which is, of course, very fierce and important fighting, but they weren't officially put into combat, handed rifles, handed fighter planes, handed bomber planes, allowed to drive tanks, and they certainly were not allowed to fire sniper rifles, but women in the Soviet Union did. About 5% of the Red Army was female, and a great many of them were shunted into support categories or communications or the hospital battalions, but there were a great many who did come into active fighting. And as I was reading about the Night Witches, I was also reading about some of these other women. And chief among those was Lady Death, was Mila Pavlichenko. And I thought immediately that, I had to tell this woman's story. Not only did she have this tremendous juxtaposition of, the single mother who wanted to be a historian someday and her life takes this incredible turn, but, she was also sent to the United States on a goodwill tour in 1942. And, while she was there, just as one does, she became very good friends with Eleanor Roosevelt. And, given all of that, I thought I have to write this story. It's too good not to write. So I sort of tucked her in my back pocket and decided I would do this at some point soon. And I ended up writing the Rose Code first, but then after that was done, I decided, all right, it is time for this story. And I'm very glad that I did decide to write it.
Me too, me too. And again, I just think it's super timely considering everything that's happening now, to kind of remind us that this was happening a long time ago, and in an odd way, it almost feels like history is repeating itself in a different way.
Oh, it certainly does.
Yes, absolutely. So let's get into Mila's life a little, because we just really kind of hit the highs of, she's this amazing sharpshooter known as Lady Death. You also just mentioned that in 1942, she came to the States with a delegation to kind of try and get American support. But going back to 1937, she was studying history at Kiev University, and she was raising her son, even though she was estranged from her husband, a surgeon who she met when she was a young woman as well. So if you don't mind, could you just tell us about Mila's life before being recruited and being a sharpshooter, and just who she is as a person as well?
Well, that was the part I really found the most surprising about her, because everyone thinks, I would think, when you hear the words, female sniper, you're going to imagine some sort of James Bond villainess with icy eyes, or at least, someone who's, absolutely made of ice. And, that's not the way she was at all. It comes to the fact that she did not want to be a sniper. It was nothing part of her life plan. All she wanted was to be a historian. She was an absolute book nerd and a good student and a little bit of a tomboy. She was good at sports. She did a little bit of shooting for fun, but she didn't take it terribly seriously for quite a while. She did eventually enjoy it enough to take an advanced course, but that was really just a hobby. What she had in mind was that she was going to make a good life for her son because she'd been a teen mother. She was made pregnant when she was only about 15 years old. The marriage with her son's father did not last, literally maybe only a matter of weeks or a few months at most. He very quickly decided, he didn't really think all that much about being a husband and father, and pretty much just walked off and abandoned them. And we know this because in her memoir, she says, fortunately, my son is nothing like his father. And I just thought, wow, there's a lot of feeling behind that word, fortunately, that she is not otherwise getting into, but you can tell it's there. So, you have this young woman whose life was, very nearly, totally derailed off the tracks as a teenager. And then, she has a baby to care for. She went to night school. Her parents supported her, helping her look after her son, who she adored. And her whole thought was just that I'm going to get my degree. I'm going to, even though I'm years behind everybody else, I'm going to get that degree. I'm going to be a historian someday. And, she's in the process of, finishing her dissertation when Hitler invades her country. And then suddenly she is faced with an extremely stark choice. She knew that, she had skills. She was actually a very good shot. And, she had those certificates. And she knew that if ordinary people, not just the army, but ordinary people like her did not defend their country, which had just been massively invaded, they were going to be overrun and taken over by the swastika, and that her son, who she adored, would grow up in the Hitler Youth learning how to Sig Heil. And she was absolutely not willing to see the remote possibility even of that happening. So she joined. And that's really what it came down to, was that she was this woman with, incredible amounts of caring, who had no idea that she would ever be a sniper on the front lines. It wasn't any part of her life plan. She was a nerd and a good student who loved her books and could absolutely geek out about history, and who wanted a good life for her child. And that's what in the end made her enlist, and meant that she had inside her incredible capabilities to become something else.
Absolutely. And I just love the human element of Mila. I loved how you portrayed her. I also loved seeing Kostya, I think that's how the name said, and how they use kind of humor to kind of get through what they're going through. Kostya was her partner. She also made time to kind of write her son letters as well. So that was also just, endearing to kind of read. But just real quick, tell us about her partner, Kostya, and, the idea to include this person in the novel as well.
Well, we know that most snipers work in pairs. Today they would call it, a sniper and a lookout. Back then it's more like, it was a little bit less formalized. It was more, they worked as partners, in that they would, have each other's backs on these very long stakeouts. And we know that this, a relationship like this would have been about as close as any relationship between two people could be. You're literally laying your life in your partner's hands night after night. And you have to know each other, right down to the fingertips, to be able to work together so closely in almost complete silence, knowing that, you could die at any moment. And, in her memoir, she does make it clear that, she's very close with her partner. But oddly enough, she doesn't mention really what happened to him. And I always wondered, well, what did? Because, clearly he was a very important man in her life. And so I ended up having to fill in the gaps there for who I thought he was and who possibly he could have been, trying to avoid spoilers here. But there is someone who was important in her life later in the war as well, and she didn't mention how he came into her life. So I sort of conflated two people, because there were rumors about her that she was involved with one of her lieutenants romantically, and there were also rumors that she was involved with her partner romantically. And I wondered if maybe what had people confused as one man might have been actually two separate relationships at very different points of her frontline life, which was extremely chaotic. So I do have a little bit of a love triangle in this book, although it's not, I like to think it's not the irritating kind where, you have one woman who can't make up her mind and two men who are totally fine with that. No, it's really more like you have one woman who is fascinated two very different men who are very good friends in their own right, and are absolutely there to support her regardless of what her romantic choice is. And that was something I sort of built out of her memoirs, partly out of what she says, but also partly out of the gaps that she leaves, because she definitely doesn't tell us everything, even though she did write her memoir later in life. There are still places where the imagination must fill things in, because otherwise you'll just have a gap. And you can't do that when you're a novelist.
Right, right, absolutely. So, getting into your writing life a bit more, I know you mentioned earlier that the idea for this novel and also Mila's story came when you were researching a previous book. But research aside, how long did it take for you to kind of pull this story together and put the Diamond Eye out there?
Oh, goodness. Well, I drafted the first draft in only about 3.5 months flat, which is really very fast for me. I had realized about midway through 2020 that I was going to write this one next. And since we were in the middle of lockdown and, all the chaos of the early COVID time, I didn't really feel up to being able to start writing yet for quite a while. So I did a lot of outlining and so forth. And then finally, when I kicked off the actual drafting of it in October, it just was off to the races. It absolutely flew out of me at an unprecedented rate. And I honestly believe that since that was October 2020 through January 2021, I think honestly my muse took one look at the world around me and just decided, I want to go somewhere more relaxing than this. I'd like to go have a spa vacation. How about somewhere, that where I feel safe and, comforted and warm, in combination, in contrast to what is going on in the world outside. How about the World War II Eastern Front? That sounds like a spa vacation right now. And literally, I think that's why it went so quickly, is my muse dove headfirst into Mila's story and pretty much did not come out. But it was done in, early January 2020. And then, it wasn't out until, March of, well, just recently. So it does take a little certain amount of time once it sort of enters the chute of the whole publication process to go through a few rounds of edits and to go through all the various copy editing processes and fact checking processes. So it does take a bit, even though it did happen fast for me. But it was only a year after the release of my previous book, The Rose Code, which is quick. And I really do think it was because it became a bit my refuge during the lockdown and during the pandemic time.
Right, right, absolutely. So, as I mentioned in my intro, you're an author of historical fiction. You had 4 novels in the Empress of Rome saga, 2 books in the Italian Renaissance, and then you came into 20th century historical fiction. I first read The Alice Network. I didn't read The Huntress, but I heard such great reviews. The Rose Code I loved. And I'm really, 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 I was riveted with Diamond Eye. So I'm really curious. Do you have like a system, a method? How was writing your other books similar to writing this one?
I think really what fascinates me is not so much a particular time period, but more the idea of what are the women of this time up to? And, what kind of women are there? What are they doing? Because quite often what I discover is that the women of whatever time it is are up to something a little more interesting and different than, the first casual glance might indicate. What I tend to look for is a group of women or a single woman who have done something extraordinary and who capture my interest and make me think, why didn't I learn about this in school? And then I dig and I find more. And those are the ones I want to write about. Those are the ladies that make me think, wow, I could hang a story on this. So, really for my book set in ancient Rome, I was writing about Roman empresses and the women who were, very much relegated to the fringes of power, but that does not mean that they didn't have influence. And then in the Italian Renaissance, I was writing about women who were observing the whole, blood and beauty of the Borgia rule under the Borgia Pope. And, again, that's a fascinating place to be, to watch the exchange of power. And then as soon as I came to the 20th century, I was finding all kinds of different stories. I found the story of a female-led spy network in World War I, which was the Alice Network. And I found the story of, the all-female regiment of bomber pilots in World War II, which was for the Huntress. And then I found the women code breakers of Bletchley Park, the Rose Code, and then I found Mila's stories. So really what I look for is the ladies. What are the ladies up to? And generally I find out they're up to something fun and I can write a book about it.
Yes, for sure. What would you say is the most difficult part of your creative process, though?
Oh, that's a good question. It is probably, there's always an idea that when you're working with history, sometimes the history goes right along with the story that you want to tell, and sometimes it feels like it fights you every step of the way. So it comes into the fact that even though you are writing historical fiction, you still have to tell a story, which means an arc. There has to be a beginning, a middle, and an end. And there has to be, your character starts in one place and then they end in another emotionally. And the idea is that even though you are dealing with historical facts, you still sort of have to hammer the historical facts into the shape of a proper story. And that's the thing that can actually be quite tricky depending on what historical facts you're using. And I do find that fun, but it can also sometimes be very frustrating.
Of course, of course. And looking back now, with all these books under your belt, if you could tell your younger writing self anything, what would it be?
I think it would be, that I found it frustrating to begin with that I wrote a lot of books that didn't necessarily go anywhere. And I would go back and tell myself, that's totally fine. Because I think, when you're getting started as a writer, you want every book to be the one you're thinking, this is the one. It's going to be the one that hits the New York Times and gets the agent, gets published, gets the big deal. And, I ended up writing a lot of books, more than 10, certainly, that ended up under the bed and will never go anywhere. And that's fine, though, because, as my mother always told me, you have to spend 10,000 hours to get good at something. And that was my 10,000 hours. It was the time when I was learning how to write a book, how to beat that historical framework into some kind of story shaped thing. And that sort of thing does take time and experience. And so I would probably tell myself, it's okay, be patient, keep trying, certainly keep working, but it's all right sometimes if you push a lot of time into something that doesn't necessarily go somewhere professionally, because nothing is wasted. And I certainly don't, in retrospect, regret any of those books I wrote, even if they do never end up going anywhere but under the bed.
What do you say? Under the bed, they're quite fine there.
Oh, yes, they're terrible. There's a reason. I look back and I think, what was I thinking? These books are terrible, but they taught me something. So that's okay. It's all right that I wrote them, even though they're terrible.
Yes, absolutely. Lessons learned for sure. So before I hop off your writing life real quick, this is where I'm going to dig for information. I want to know, have you happened upon any other really great female stories out there that you're going to tell us? Are you writing anything right now? Will there be any other books in our future? What can you tell us?
Oh, absolutely. I am always writing. I always have, I'm probably 5 or 6 books deep on things I would love to write and don't know if I will get to or not, because I can't write fast enough to keep up with the flow of the ideas. My next book is titled The Briar Club, tentatively, and that is going to be about 1950s Washington, D.C., McCarthyism, the Red Scare, all of that very rich and fertile area, which I'm really enjoying digging into right now. I also did something with the Diamond Eye where I laid a little bit of a cameo for myself with one of Mila's friends, who was mentioned in a few places, and I would like to write a book about her. So I sort of cameoed her in advance. And I thought, well, fingers crossed, if I can get to her story and write another, Soviet heroine in World War II, then I will write her story. We'll see if that happens. So there's all kinds of things I'd love to write. And there's all kinds of women out there I would love to showcase in books of their own. And I just hope I, have time to get to all of them.
See, my interest is super piqued when you said McCarthyism.
Yes, I thought it would be fun to get away from World War II for at least one book. And, because I have had it for the last few books. And I thought, but this whole period is so rich and so dark behind all this, surface gloss of 1950s prosperity and white picket fences and the 2.5 children at every suburban house and all this Leave It to Beaver stuff on TV. There's all this darkness behind that. There's the Cold War. There is the looming threat of nuclear annihilation. There is the fact that, the Soviet Union, which was, in Mila's book, the ally for the United States, is now very much the enemy. And, then there's, the Red Scare and McCarthy and so much going on. So I'm really enjoying the chance to delve into that because it's a very different set of historical facts from the ones I've had for my last few books.
Well, we're going to have to make it a date because that's something I really want to read. I really want to discuss. So whenever that book makes it out there, you need to come back on the show.
Absolutely will. We'll make a date of it.
Awesome. Okay, so getting really quick in your reading life, because even though I know we're here to talk about the Diamond Eye, I want to know what you're reading. I know my listeners want to know what you're reading as well. So tell us about the last book or books that you finished reading that you'd now recommend.
Well, one of the books that I was very grateful, it came out the same day as mine, so I got to dive into somebody else's fun and funny story, was Four Aunties and a Wedding by Jessica Q. Sutanto, which is delightful. And recently for a cover quote, I read a debut novel, which I really enjoyed and found very powerful, called The Memory Keeper of Kiev, which is by Aaron Litkin. And that's very important, a bit of history, I think, because that talks about Ukraine as well, and the Holodomor, which is I'm probably butchering that pronunciation, but it's the starvation of Ukraine during the 30s. And it's a bit of history we all need to know, I think. And then I would say as well, I also really enjoyed V.E. Schwab's recent release, Gallant, which is this absolute delicious gothic fairy tale of a book. So I'm always reading a lot, and I really have read some great ones recently.
Awesome. And what books are on your nightstand or books you're looking forward to reading in the year ahead?
Oh, goodness. I know one I'm really looking forward to reading is my friend Stephanie Dre's book, Madam Secretary, on Frances Perkins, who was the first female member of a president's cabinet and, really the architect of the New Deal. I want to read for fantasy The Jasmine Throne, which I have not gotten around to yet, by Tasha Suri. And, oh goodness, what else? I've been hearing great things about the novel The Circus Train by Amita Parikh, which is a Canadian author, and I'm really looking forward to getting into that too.
Yay. Awesome. Some great reading ahead, it sounds like.
Oh, yes.
Amazing. So we're also big lovers of indie bookstores here on the show. I ask all our guests, so of course I'm going to ask you to share with our listeners some of your favorite indie bookstores.
Oh, goodness. There are so many that are wonderful. I remember when I went on book tour, Parnassus in Nashville is a wonderful place to go. And, my local in San Diego is Warwick's and La Jolla. That's not very far from San Diego, and they are so wonderful. I always look forward to going back there.
Oh, love it. That's amazing. So kind of wrapping things together real quick, Kate, I know you've done your job. You've written the book. You've given us the Diamond Eye. It's up to us readers. I've read it. I loved it. And for other readers to read themselves. But what are you kind of hoping for in a hypothetical world? What reactions are you hoping for? What are some thoughts you're hoping readers might maybe have?
Well, I always hope simply, first and foremost, that I have entertained you or moved you, because that's the first job of a storyteller, which is just simply to entertain. Because right back to the days when it was early man huddled around a fire for the night and someone saying, I've got a story, and everyone else leaning in to say, and then what happened? So I hope that I entertained, and I hope that I, in some way moved you. For the specific story, I would say that what I hope for is for people to walk away with the idea and the question that we are all hopefully capable of tremendous things. Because that's really what, in essence, Mila's story became about when I was writing it, is the idea that this woman who otherwise would have led a quite ordinary life, the single mother, the aspiring historian, the graduate student, a library researcher, became a war heroine and defended her country and possibly changed history. And she didn't want any of that, but the unfortunate part is that she was, thrown into what she called the baptism of fire. And, in an ideal world, none of us would have to face a baptism of fire. Single mothers would raise their children without having to join the army to fend off invaders. And, aspiring historians could just finish their dissertations in peace. But unfortunately, there will come a time in anybody's life where you get tossed into a crucible. Hopefully that is not such a horrible crucible as the invasion of your country, but you will face some sort of challenge. And at that point, that is when we all find out what we are made of. And what it was in Lyudmila Pavlichenko's case is that this ordinary woman was placed into a crucible and turned into a diamond under the pressure, and that we all carry the same possibilities within us. So I hope people walk away with the idea of, if she could become that, if she could do that when the hour of necessity came for her, I wonder what I could do.
Yep, absolutely. And it was a powerful story. It was riveting for me. I couldn't stop turning the pages fast enough. I wanted to know what was going on. And I loved it. I loved meeting Mila.
Oh, thank you.
Discovering her story. And also, again, it's just like reflecting on what's happening in real life right now, especially in Ukraine. Yeah, it kind of brought everything back home for me as well. But Kate, thank you so much for coming on the show and speaking with me. It's been an absolute pleasure.
No, thank you so much for having me. I'm so glad you enjoyed the book. And thank you again. We will make a date for it for the Briar Club when that comes out.
Yay! Amazing. I love it.
Thank you so much for tuning in to The Reader's Couch. You can find out more about the show and submit your questions for our guest by visiting our website, thereaderscouch.com. You can also connect with us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at The Couch Is Booked. If you like the show, please subscribe, share, and take a few seconds to leave a rating and review. Next week, I'll be back with new guests, more books, and some fun games we can play. But until then, stay lounging, stay reading, and whenever you're in doubt, go straight to your local bookstore or library. Thanks for listening, and happy reading.